A man chooses, a slave obeys.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
When I started this podcast, there was one person that I immediately knew that I wanted to invite to talk about ethics in video games with me and Andy. And it's Jose Zagal is here with us today in our 20th milestone episode. I actually tried to time that a little bit, Jose, because I thought it would be a cool, round number guest. Jose Zagal is a professor at the University of Utah's top-ranked game development program. He teaches a variety of classes, including game design and ethics in video games. I don't know which one of us started teaching this class first, but as far as I know, we're the only two people in the world teaching a class on ethics in video games, unless Jose is going to tell me otherwise. Jose, do you know, is that true?
I don't know, actually. We can track it. I think I started teaching in 2008. You started teaching this class in 2008? Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I haven't seen anybody else, and you're the only one that I've come up with. So you might have been the only one. I started in 2015. So for 7 years, you might have been the only one, and then I came along, and then someone might come along in 7 more years or 7 months. We'll see how that goes.
We'll see. And it's actually a bit more complicated on my end, but I'll get into that, I think, later on in today's episode.
All right. Besides this, Jose is also active on the academic side of things, publishes research papers, analyzing and theorizing about games, and more importantly for today's conversation, exploring the intersection of and overlaps of ethics in video games. He publishes numerous articles on the topic, many freely available online, and also edited the Video Game Ethics Reader. When I had the idea of doing a class on the intersection of ethics and video games in 2014, it was that reader, and especially the articles that Jose wrote about designing ethics in video games, that really formed the backbone and part of the inspiration of that course. And for that, I'm forever indebted because it's been a totally interesting experience. Jose was honored as a distinguished game scholar by Digital Game Research Association and as a fellow by the Higher Education Video Game Alliance. You can follow him on Twitter at Jose Zagal. Jose Zagal, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you.
All right.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really honored. And it's always exciting as an academic to hear that your work has some impact or some effect on others. So thank you very much. That really honors me.
All right. I look forward to honoring you some more. All right. Look, let me be honest. It was really hard to decide what to discuss with you on this episode, right? Because in part because I really loved your articles about incorporating ethics in game design, and there's definitely a part where I would love for you to come back and discuss that with us. But we decided to focus on the idea of teaching ethics, and the teaching part, right? Teaching ethics in video games itself, because we're both believers in the importance of people thinking about ethics in and of video games, but we know nothing about each other's classes, aims, hopes, and about the impact that classes like this might have on game design. I do know that we come into this topic from different directions, right? Me as a moral philosopher, you as a game scholar, and of course we've got Andy with us, who's a game designer, which is interesting, Andy, because I don't know if I've ever talked to you about the impact of my class on our students. Maybe you could give me some feedback on that too. And Jose and I, none of us have ever met before. So let's exchange ideas, get inspired, and learn something about what learning about ethics in video games can do.
Cool.
Let's start with this. How did you get interested in ethics in video games in the first place?
I guess the one-word answer would be serendipitously. So I just graduated from Georgia Tech with my PhD, and I was on the job market, and I was fortunate enough to get an offer to start at DePaul University in Chicago. And so prior to the move over to Chicago from Atlanta, which is where Georgia Tech is located, I was asked, hey, so you're starting in the fall, what would you like to teach? And I was basically given two options, the intro game design class or an ethics in video games and cinema class.
So they already had this class on the books.
Yes, this class already existed. So it's not a class that I invented. And that's sort of... now, it is a class that when I started teaching it, it did change a bit, and its curriculum did change in significant ways. But it was not an original invention of mine. That's what I want to make that super clear. Like, I didn't invent this class. Obviously, I chose to teach the ethics class. And my reasoning at the time was, I've taught game design before. I think I know a fair amount about game design, but I don't really know anything about ethics. I know a lot about games, not a lot about ethics. And so it seemed like a really interesting opportunity for me as a young scholar, as a sort of just starting off professor, to be able to start on something that was fresh and new and that seemed exciting to me at the time, and it still is. And also as a way, kind of a palate cleanser from the dissertation work, right? I was really looking to like, okay, what's a new project that I want to start working on? So I'm starting at DePaul, and I'm teaching this class on games and cinema. I was hired to work in the games program there. So there was a program that already existed with students in a major and so on. I asked around and said, so what has, what have you guys been teaching? What's the curriculum? And so one of my colleagues there, Charlie Wilcox, he was very generous, and he basically said, look, here's all my materials, all my slides. And in the time between I've been thinking about what I'm going to teach and my getting there, I had a whole lot of ideas that like, wow, this is so exciting. I'm sure they talk about this. I'm sure this is part of the curriculum and this. Mostly from the game stuff. I didn't really put much thought into the cinema stuff, and that's to my discredit, I guess. And so as I'm teaching this class, I'm realizing that a lot of the content in the class is not the content that I think is the most interesting for the class. And so I start to make changes to the class. And this class, I was teaching it, I think, pretty much every quarter. So at DePaul University. And then when I moved to Utah, I think I maybe had about a break of a year of not teaching ethics and games. And so by the time I'm Utah, like they've said, well, you used to teach this thing. Would you like to teach this again? And so I did. So this is a class that I've been teaching pretty much continuously since 2008. And even while I was at DePaul, because it was taught across multiple sections, my section was we're going to focus mostly on games section. There are other people teaching the same class, but they had a different emphasis, and they were all doing their own thing in that sense as well.
Well, that's fascinating. It's fascinating, first off, that there is enough people in the class to have more than one section.
Yes.
I mean, even back in 2008, the game development as a university, a department was barely getting started. It feels like
it definitely existed, and I think it didn't have a lot of visibility outside of the university space. This was for games and cinema, and so it was also grabbing all the students that were in the film program.
I see.
The game program was really popular, obviously, and it was also a required class, which makes it extra required. Right. So everyone in the major had to take this class.
Right. And then at the University of Utah, did they already have the class, or did you create it there for them?
I created it at Utah.
Yeah, that's great.
I also created a graduate version of the class as well. So I teach a graduate version maybe once a year or every other year once. The ethics for the undergrads, I'm teaching every semester now. I'm sort of in the same, I don't want to call it a hole because it sounds like I'm not happy and I don't like it, but, or it's not a rut either, but it's sort of, there's enough demand. It's also a required class now. There's so much demand that I feel like I have to teach it every semester in order to not cause problems for all the students who want to graduate, obviously.
I've been teaching it every semester, and we're year round for the last, almost 7 years at this point. And this is the first summer that I haven't taught it. Teaching everything every single semester, right, can just feel like you want a break from it. So it's interesting. I actually when I started, I made up a class for being in LA for ethics of cinema. And I came up with a class of ethics of cinema, and I was essentially showing it to some of the film professors that were near the philosophy department. And they said, if you think like ethics of film is cool, you should really check out, there's some really interesting things happening in video games. And I wasn't a big gamer, and I thought, okay, let me try that. And, I remember at the time, the game recommended was Heavy Rain. And later on, Jose, I read your paper on Heavy Rain, and it was one of my favorites. It remains one of my favorites ever. And playing Heavy Rain really kind of convinced me. I was like, oh my God, there's so much here. And I put together a syllabus and just sent it out to universities to see who would pick up on it. And the New York Film Academy just put something like that actually on the syllabus because of Gamergate. So what happened was when Gamergate happened, the dean essentially said, we got to make sure that our game department, understands issues about sexism, and we need something like this. And I think it came down actually, literally from the dean on down. You want to make the game design students have a class like this, but no one really knew how to teach it. And it just happened that I sent them a syllabus at the same time. This is actually how I ended up getting my job at the New York Film Academy, Andy.
Oh, okay.
I teach the same exact class to MFAs and the BFAs without any changes at all. And I'm kind of curious to the master students just do it better, but the material I have is exactly the same. So okay. Let me ask you this. It's interesting having a kind of notice, right? Gamergate. God, that seems so far behind us. And of course, it's not like sexism is that far, behind us. But what do you think is the point of teaching a class on ethics to game design? Because this is so rare, and this is such a an afterthought in so many game design programs.
So I think there's three big answers to that. And I'll start from the most basic to then the most specific. I think the most basic is, I think it's important for people to learn how to think and how to reason and how to make arguments and to reflect and to think about sort of the purpose of life and what does it mean to be good and those kinds of things. And maybe we can slot this into it's part of a liberal arts education, or it's what it means to be educated in the broad sense of the term. And so I think that's important. So even for someone who isn't interested in making games, I think learning something about moral philosophy, and if it's in a context of something that is perhaps familiar to you, that's perhaps a win, or can make it more relatable, more interesting, more engaging, more thought-provoking. I think everyone should know something about moral philosophy. And I look at myself and I say, man, I did take philosophy in high school, 2 years of it. I don't remember anything. I remember names of authors, and right. I feel that was like, if I could go back in time and say, hey, Jose, you should pay more attention to this class, I slapped myself a couple of times, right, for missing that opportunity.
It's very hard. First of all, it's awesome, when you get philosophy in high school. I always think that's really great. And it's so rare, in the United States for that to happen. But a lot of those questions are, I think, much harder to take seriously. At that age. By the way, Andy and I recently had an episode called Why Play, that essentially kind of tries to connect the reasons you might have for what kind of games you should play to the reasons you should have for how you should live your life.
Yeah. So that's the first layer.
That's the first layer. Okay. Yeah. Let's go
the
deeper.
The second layer, I think, this is focused to specific students. So I think for students who are interested in working in the games industry, I think this is a class that is important for them to have, because they will become professionals. And then this question is, what does it mean to be a professional, first of all? But then furthermore, what does it mean to behave ethically and correctly in your job, and to understand the implications that the work you do might have, to understand the consequences of your work on other people, and so on and so forth. So this is in the guise of, a lot of programs will have a professional ethics class. I'm doing air quotes. And I'm doing air quotes not because I don't think they're good classes, but rather because I think fundamentally professional ethics is something that should be across the curriculum. So I don't think it's the sort of thing, well, I'm really ethical in this class, but when it comes down to my graphics class, I do whatever. We should be ethical all the time. And the ethical work of being a graphics programmer is still important and relevant. But this is a class that kind of draws in all these ideas. And so we talk about crunch, and we talk about sexism in the industry, we talk about representation, and we talk about different loot boxes is a hot thing that we've been talking about for the last couple of years now. So a lot of it has to do with the behaving and acting professionally and ethically as a professional. and also looking at things that are happening in the industry and discussing them and talking about them and being able to make sense of them, right? To understand, well, why would this company do this thing this way, and try to understand like what is happening there, and also would I do the same thing if I was in that situation, and why or why not? So that's the second layer.
That sounds exactly like professional ethics, right? I mean,
Yes.
I've taught classes in business ethics, let's say, right, where we talk very much specifically about the roles that you're going to play, and I've taught classes in medical ethics, right, and those classes are different, right? In both cases, I was training future professionals in those fields, so they weren't just kind of academic exercises. And it's interesting that besides those two fields, it's there's classes in journalistic ethics and sometimes in media ethics, but it's very rare for other professions to kind of think of themselves as needing a kind of dedicated time to think about the ethical obstacles in their field. But when you do it, I've always felt that it not only does it make you a better professional in the sense of I think you can think about what it is that you want, what it is that would make you proud of the kind of career that you have. And also think of the, I think, overall value of your career, besides its obvious value to you.
Yeah. Are you doing good? And what does that mean, right?
Right.
And like when we talk about games, like it's interesting you bring up sort of medical ethics and business ethics, and I think we see this in all these other fields as well. So lawyers also have a lot of engineers, also programmers, and so on. And then the question becomes, well, what are particular ethical issues or concerns that are salient in the games industry because of what the games industry does? If I'm a lawyer, confidentiality is a really big deal, right? And also the issues of like defending and doing the right thing by your client who might in fact be guilty, right? And how do you do that? How do you separate those two things? If you're a doctor, being a doctor implies harming people, right? I'm getting a heart transplant. Like somebody's literally going to harm me, my body. I'm going to cut it open and do something. But ideally, it's for like in my best interest, right? Ideally, it will result in me being healthier and so on. And so the Hippocratic Oath is a big part of the medical profession and education. And so for games, what is it, right? Are we engaging in practices that lead to addiction? Are we manipulating our players? Are we misleading them? How do we, all these issues that I'm sure you talk about in your class and I talk about mine.
It's interesting because I do see one big difference, and I've thought about this in terms of the training aspect, right, of a course like this, and a lawyer and a doctor, and let's say even when I teach, let's say, business ethics, right, I can think very much of, okay, you're in management, right? Management comes with a certain set of responsibilities. You're in marketing. Marketing involves a certain set of responsibilities. But the video game world seems to be full of lots of different positions, some of which I don't quite understand, in a way that is much and also maybe subject to the actions of higher level decision making, because it's such a collaborative process, right? It's not just you with a client, right? It's such a huge collaborative process, and I've never actually, I don't know if I've figured out. I kind of pretend that you have control over the process, but then when you become like a low level artist or level designer, and you might never face these kind of big level questions. And I've never kind of been able to figure out what exactly to do about that.
I think so. There's the generic, anyone in a management position is going to have to deal with the issues of dealing with people and firing people, hiring people, interviewing, all that kind of stuff, and managing relations. But I think there are some issues that I think cut across all kinds of disciplines or areas or job titles in the company, right? So I think talking about intellectual property is important. And I don't mean just in the sense of understanding the law, but understanding why do we have this in the first place? And games as an industry is built upon, and in my opinion, the main driver for innovation in games is the fact that we can easily look at someone else's mechanic and system and basically port it over to our game, right? And that's what pushes game design and game forward, right? And that's because there's a certain attitude with regards to, and support in this case by legislation, to game mechanics and systems and so on. We don't have the same for other kinds of intellectual property that shows up in games, right? So characters and your artwork and your music and all that is strictly protected. And so as people who are thinking of joining the industry, I think it's important for them to think, well, how could things be like? And what am I missing out because of the way things are structured now? And why would it be okay for me to take someone else's character and make some changes and incorporate my game? Or why might it not be okay from a moral perspective, right? And I think that cuts across whether you're an engineer who's looking at some source code on Stack Overflow and going like, oh, here's someone who solved the problem that I'm trying to solve right now, and maybe you're copy pasting that code, or you're using open source software, or using a third-party tool that gives you access to certain things or doesn't give you access to others, or your entire game is built upon this idea that players are going to make most of the content. And what moral right do you have to assert ownership over their content, right? I made all these really amazing Mario level makers and Mario Maker levels, and I have no way to pull them out of the game. I'm not saying I want the character of Mario. I'm saying like I want my layout, my design, the rules that I've implemented by putting certain blocks in certain locations. Why can't I? Right? I can't. Like it's all owned by Nintendo. Right. Nintendo just released, I'm blanking on the name right now, their new game, which is a game making tool. And the first question in my mind is, hey, what happens to those games? Who owns those? Right.
Those are great questions I have never considered. Fantastic. Right. I'm already getting some new ideas.
Yeah, I mean, Dreams by Media Molecule. I love Media Molecule. I love their games. I love their products and so on. I love Little Big Planet. Little Big Planet was incredibly successful in part because of an entire community of users that was making games and creating entertainment for others. Right. Some of those saw profit in that sense because the higher ups at Media Molecule were like, oh, we really appreciate the stuff you're doing. We want to hire you on, come join our company. But for most people, like in other markets, we might call this exploitation, right? Here's people who are willingly going in and making levels and creating content, and someone else is profiting from that. So there's a moral issue there, right? I'm not saying I know the answer to that, but I think it's like I would hope and imagine that professionals would consider these kinds of things, right? And be aware of that and say, well, are we doing the right thing? How do we give back? Should we give back? Should we not? So on and so forth.
Right. I feel like that question got brought up in regards to, because there's a lot of web content. So within the web industry and the people, creating journals online for other people to read and all of that, Facebook, and anytime you're creating posts like that, you're creating content for other people, but you're really creating it for this company that owns the website. So I feel like we've sort of gotten inured to that through the web industry, and so now it's just sort of creeping into other places.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole fan fiction is the thing, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But I think what is different about games, or perhaps interesting, is that games have always had this thread of sharing stuff, right? The earliest, before there was even an industry, we're talking about games that are being shared by people like Adventure on mainframe computers, right? Like I just wrote this game and it's called, Lunar Lander, and now it appears everywhere. So that's always been a part of video games, perhaps more specifically, right? Or games as being a sort of a folk culture, right? Who invented tag? I don't know. I don't care. We couldn't figure this out. Who invented chess? Right. It's always been part of our culture where we sort of remix and borrow things and so on. And so games have thrived on that, right? This idea that the game comes with a tool to make levels for it, I think is kind of a game thing, right? You don't buy a novel and in the back there's an appendix with like, here's how to write some more chapters for this novel.
Right. Here's some blank pages at the end. Write your own ending.
Yeah. But for games, it's pretty common, right? This idea comes with modding has been a thing, right? The tools for creating new games and so on. And we've seen the industry benefit from this too, right? So many games that started off as a mod, of a mod, like at this point, it's mods of mods of mods, mods of mods. Like I show Fortnite in class, which isn't literally a mod, but you can just pick PUBG and there's like 5 steps between PUBG and like the original expansion of a game that came out, and there's all steps in between were mods essentially.
Right, and that initial game that came out was probably a variant of some other game that had come out before. Yeah. Right.
Exactly. So ownership of ideas, that's one thing that I think cuts across whether you're an engineer, an artist, a designer, maybe even a producer, and so on. And so we try to touch upon some of these things in the class, even if some of them might be more managerial. I think some are still, it's your 9 to 5. I'm coding. I think this still applies.
Let's piggyback on that and get to our classes themselves. So I guess first of all, who are your students? What are they like, and what are you teaching them?
Okay, I'm going to play the naughty interviewee, though. I'm sorry.
Oh, do it.
The first question you asked me, I said I had like 3 layers, and I did layer 1.
Did
layer
we never get to the third layer?
Let's get third
We never
layer.
got to
Let's
the third
do
one.
it. All right.
Which I'm only bringing this up because, in my opinion, it's the one that is personally most interesting to me, like in my own life, as it were. So,
Right.
okay, there's this matters because general culture and liberal arts. This matters because you're a professional and work in the industry. But the third layer for me is, I think games as a creative, artistic, and expressive medium are particularly well aligned with thinking about issues of ethics. And exploring and understanding that potential, I think, is really exciting and interesting. And the sort of the example I use in class, or the way I discuss with the students, I say, look, music, you can experience a lot of emotions when you listen to music. In fact, music, of all the media of creative artistic expression, is perhaps the one that is best suited to making me want to feel that I want to move my body, for example. Right? Mm-hmm. I think, okay, yeah, people understand this. Like, yeah, music makes you want to move, you want to dance, and so on. I'm reading a novel that rarely happens, right? I don't feel like moving my body when I'm reading. If I'm watching a movie, maybe because there's music. Okay. So if you think of all the range of human emotions, for example, I think games kind of tap into a lot of them, obviously, but there's some which you don't really get that well in other media. Pride, guilt, shame. These are experiences that I've had playing games, and that might have tangentially had in other media, but I think in games it's specific. And it has to do with this idea that you are acting in the game and therefore somehow feel that you're somehow responsible for your actions. And so you might feel pride in your achievements. Like if I read a book and I feel like, I'm really proud. Did I feel pride while reading that book? No, I might feel pride when I finish it because it was long, it was complicated, it was challenging. But in a game, like that happens a lot, right? Mm-hmm. Shame, guilt, remorse. And so that's an area I think that games as a medium for philosophers, I think specifically, it could be like super exciting, right? Even if you think of games as systems, right? We can think of, so I'm going to say, I'm not the philosopher in the house, but I'm just going to roll in these concepts together, and I hope you will let me slide without going by the book on this.
You do what you do.
Okay. So a lot of times ethics is about rules for life, think of it, okay? Or a way of understanding how you should go about living your life. In some cases, it's like, this is the right thing to do, and if you do the wrong thing, you will be punished in these ways, for example, right? So a lot of religions have this idea, like these are the good things to do. If you don't, punishment. Or they might say, look, these are good things to do for these reasons, right? And you think about games, a lot of games, that's how basically games operate. There's rules. As a player, I figure them out, and the game is giving me feedback and letting me know, hey, you're doing things right. You're making progress, you're succeeding, or you're doing things wrong. You need to go back and do this thing again till you'll do it right. Now, what if we replace those rules with ideas about ethics, right? So if Kant were alive today and he said, you know what, I could write a book or I could make a game. What if I made a game where the world of the game implemented my ideas about moral philosophy? Like, this is the world the way I think it should be. And as you play the game, you can learn about these ideas and participate in this world. And hopefully you, the player, will be like, oh my God, this world is amazing. Like, I wish the real world were like this. Now I know what I need to do out in the real world in order to get to a world that's closer to what is in this game. Right? You can imagine someone else, Bentham, Mill, they'll go like, well, I think the game is different because I think the world should be like in this different way, right? And you could play their own game and kind of understand their ideas about moral philosophy from the rules of the game and how the game functions, as it were.
And notice how you're taking these really abstract ideas about how people should live their lives, how society should be structured, and you're letting someone experience them, right? Try them out, right? And yeah, this idea of I absolutely agree with you so much, and this idea of taking responsibility, right, for your actions, right? the things you don't take responsibility for are things that you can't, you can't really apply to yourself in the same sense, right? Especially pride and shame, right? This idea of, right, you can only be be proud of things you've done. You can only be ashamed of things that you've done. You're not going to get that in another medium because you're not doing, right? But a game can really make you do, right? And kind of put you in those kinds of situations that also could be engineered to specifically get you to have a certain kind of experience and to reflect on it in a certain way. And that's amazing.
Exactly.
To me, that's my favorite thing about video games.
Yeah.
I love the idea of philosophers being able to make a game, and then like watching people play it and go, "Oh, that's not what I meant at all."
It's also hard if you're someone like Kant, but it is also interesting to see, a lot of these philosophers were also, they were armchair psychologists too, in an age where people didn't do quantitative studies about anything. Right. So they had certain ideas about what people were really like and what people would really do, but, put those people in an MMO and let's see what they do. Right.
And the funny thing is we go into game design thinking the same things, right? We have an idea of what our players are going to do and what our players are going to like. And then, frequently we find out that we're quite wrong.
Oh, of course. Yeah. All the time.
So tell us about the class itself. What's your class like, and what are your students like?
So currently, I'll speak to my class here at the University of Utah, just because that's the more recent one. So the undergraduate class, we actually have a cross-listed section with philosophy. So I will have usually a minority of students who are not in the games program. Otherwise, everyone in the class is in the games program and or is games adjacent enough that they want to work in the industry, is usually the case. And I would describe, depending on who I'm talking to, I describe the class differently. So for philosophers, I would say, look, this class it's a philosophy 101 class. We're going to cover utilitarianism. We're going to cover Kant and social contract theory and virtue ethics and feminist ethics and so on. But all of this in the context of games. It's like, oh, okay, I understand that. Yeah, so we have lots of those classes. We do a, intro to philosophy, cinema, cowboy movies or whatever it is.
Okay.
Right? And so I think they understand that. And the class is that. I'm not exaggerating, right? So I have a lot of students like, man, I thought this class was going to be about games, but it's like all this philosophy stuff. It's like, yep, it's half philosophy. For the game students, say, look, in this class, we're going to talk about games, and we're going to talk about games in a way where we're going to take them seriously. And we're going to poke holes at games, and we're going to, shake them around, and we're going to be critical of the industry, but not in the tearing down the sense, more in the, this is important, so let's talk about stuff that is important. This is stuff that you care about. So let's examine the thing that you care about from a slightly different angle where you could learn something and have some insight. And so I guess the common complaint is from the non-game students is, wow, there's so much games. I wish there was more philosophy. And for the game students, they're like, man, that game stuff was super cool. I wish there was more of that and less philosophy. And so I think that if that balance, if that is the tenor of the complaints, then that's good. That's like the needle has been threaded, right?
Right.
Everyone is feeling challenged a bit and wanting more of something that they're not getting out of the class. In terms of the students, they're all interested in working in games, coming from lots of disciplines, right? So engineers, artists, designers, producers, they're all in the class together. All of the classes required, it doesn't have like a fixed spot in the curriculum grid, as it were. So sometimes it's an upper level class just by virtue of the numbering, but that does not mean to say that this is a class that all students take in their senior year, for example. So I get sophomores, freshmen perhaps not so much. Definitely sophomores, juniors, and seniors in the class.
Just for comparison, I do the class in two different ways. Either it's just game designers. Usually it's their last semester. But I also run this class as an elective, which for film students, where I have, because I work at a film school. So, I have actors, screenwriters, filmmakers, which are, there's an interesting difference because many of them are much more into storytelling. and understand storytelling much better, and in some ways sometimes do considerably better than my game design students in many aspects of it. What about the class itself?
So the class itself, I would say, is the way it's currently structured, and I'm always tinkering with it and changing things around and changing the assignments and so on. What I tell students is, okay, in this class, I'm gonna give you a bunch of ethical tools to put in your toolbox, so that then as you go about your life, you can use these tools to think through issues. I'm going to discuss them a lot in the context of games, but these are standard vanilla tools, as it were. So basically we'll spend one class day talking about utilitarianism, and they'll have a reading from a moral philosophy book. And then perhaps the next 2 or 3 class sessions, we might discuss game things for which there is a strong utilitarian angle, as it were. So for example, when we talk about utilitarianism, after that, we're going to talk about media effects. Because when you hear about games in the media, a lot of times it's in the context of games are bad because they're going to do bad things to people. Like violent games are bad because they might lead kids to be violent, and so on. And so I'll sort of try to frame let's talk about game stuff in the context of like the framework that they're getting. When we talk about social contract theory, after that we'll talk about intellectual property, and we'll talk about games and in that context, because it is about rights, right? This idea of rights and duties and responsibilities and so on. There are some topics that kind of like, I really like to talk about cheating in class. I spend a whole class talking about cheating. I haven't necessarily connected it to a specific framework, as it were. But I say generally that's the structure. There's a moral framework that they're getting, and then some game-related classes. For Kant, I don't think I have a specific class tied to that. We do cover relativism once, and mostly for me to tell them, like, don't use it, but here's why it could be important for you to know. And I'm not as effective with that message as I would like.
Sure.
So doing that. In terms of assignments, there's a midterm and a final that have sort of questions that they need to write answers to. And I'm more than happy to share all these resources to anybody who's interested in the class, either listening or yourself. And for assignments, I have them do an assignment which I call the one-page analysis. I give them a list of games, and they have to pick a game from that list. They have to play the game a bunch of times, and then they have to write a one-page paper on that game. And in that paper, they need to tell me something, make either some kind of moral argument about the game, or tell me something that's interesting about this game in the moral ethical context. And so I try to pick games that have lots of different papers that could be written about. So back in the day, I had Heavy Rain. Back in the day, I had Detroit Become Human. And I rotate the games out just for my own sanity, because there's only so many papers I can read about BioShock.
I'd love to hear about some of the games that you do assign and you do have on your list, because I'm sure it's a pretty interesting list. It's interesting because I teach my class in a very different way, which is, God, I was hoping for that.
So I listened to an earlier episode of this podcast, and you were talking about a game that you play in class. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so excited that I really want to learn more about that and so on. So I suspect we either have like 20 more episodes, or we have a long offline conversation. Because one of the things I think my class doesn't do is I don't do a lot of sort of practical, like we don't play games other than the games that they're assigned. And I feel that's kind of a missed opportunity for me.
There's games that I ask them to play that, though we don't ever really play any games in class, because we just don't have, when Andy teaches classes, he has, I think, his regular class, and then the game period, the gameplay, right, class is a separate thing.
So I teach the first semester intro to game design, and it's twice as long as almost all the other classes. So I have time to sit down and play games with them. We play a lot of board games and card games and a lot of tabletop games. So I have lots of time to play games in my classes. Right,
and I don't have that. And it's interesting because I teach a lot of applied ethics courses. So when I teach ethics of video games, in the beginning, my first day is essentially just I have a whole bunch of hypothetical games. And I ask them I put them in groups. I have them essentially make moral judgments about these games, rate their morality, as a group, compare to each other, discuss it, and we talk about issues there, potential sexism and representation, manipulation, dark patterns, games that touch on reality, so kind of stuff like that. And then the next 2 weeks, I kind of give them a crash course in ethics basics, where I just throw all the theories in there, and like you do, try to make sure that they're not relativists. But let's say I do content like 3 slides, and remember this idea that he thinks that dignity comes from the ability to make your own decisions, and that's a key thing when we think about player autonomy. And but I kind of focus. I only do really like a week and a half on the ethical theory, and then I leave all the theory behind. But what I do add is, and this is something I take from my something that I came up with when I was at USC with a business professor guy. I teach him a step-by-step way of making ethical decisions. So it's an ethical decision-making procedure. It's kind of an 8-step procedure, and we watch an actual movie. Oh my God, it escapes my mind all of a sudden. What movie it is? But we watch a movie, and we kind of take a big decision in the movie, and as groups they kind of walk through that decision. So they're getting practice in ethical decision making, and then later on when they do presentations, they pick a topic in video games that they're going to present on, and they have to kind of make an ethical decision from the perspective of the game company, or maybe the government, or maybe the player, depending on kind of the topic. Once that's done, essentially I divide the course into 2 after that. Social issues, where we do violence with the gamer's dilemma.
Okay.
Right. So comparing, and we did a show on the gamer's dilemma.
Yes, I've listened to that one as well. I've been working my way up.
Oh, great! We did a show on it, and Facebook will not let me boost that episode because apparently it deals with social issues, and it had the name pedophilia in it.
Yeah, that could be tricky,
right? But do that, issues about representation and sexism, cheating as well. Censorship is another big one that we get into. So these are
moral panics.
Huh?
Moral panics?
Not really moral panics, but I think at some point we talk about the idea of a moral panic, right?
We have they've come up in conversation, but we haven't focused anything on moral panics yet.
Right, and you and I have talked about moral panics, right? When it comes to censorship, right? As definitely a possibility. Beside that, manipulation. Right, and kids, right? So those are kind of manipulation kids. I think that's kind of an end around there. Then I have a second part, which is my last 5 weeks, which is my favorite part, where the beginning introduction to that section actually has your picture on it.
With like darts on it, or
I just realized that it's, I think you like pointing or something about ethically notable games.
Oh, okay.
And we discuss ethically notable games, and it's dedicated essentially to how to make create a moral dimension to games. And which is definitely inspired. Again, this is inspired by your writing, kind of to begin with. And what I have them do is essentially they have a project that we take 5 weeks in doing of creating a game that tries to take a social issue and explore it in a game. Right? Okay. So this is something I'm personally really, really interested in, right? So when you were talking about, right, the real power of games, right, to give you these kind of ethical experiences, I want them to do that. Obviously, I want them to think about doing that. It's not easy to do, but we kind of, they have a project where every week we kind of talk about, the idea of what is ethically notable, how moral dilemmas work, different techniques for creating ethical reflection, morally complex characters, right? And they kind of build, I don't know, what do you call those things, Andy? Where you've seen...
a pitch document, basically.
Yeah, something like a pitch document. And we work on it every week. So every week we look at the ongoing process and kind of talk about it. And by the end, they've got, usually Some of them have good ideas. Some of them don't have very good ideas. But it's that creative process, right? That we're trying to kind of do with it, and we go that way. So it has relatively in there. I throw little bits from philosophy, like we talk about different models of corporate social responsibility, stuff like that. We talk about negligence and recklessness and manipulation, and and marketing and stuff like that. But for the most part, it's either the social issues or how do we bring this stuff into games, right?
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that someday one of my graduates, will actually make a game. My personal thing that I really, really want is I want people to go out and make more serious games, like Peacemaker, like Papers, Please, that explore certain issues. And I'm hoping that they could do that if they feel it's less daunting to do that. Because, God, it seems really hard to... I've had so far 3 pretty good ideas about games about abortion. And, God, who wants to make a game about abortion?
Out of how many?
The people that tried, let's say pretty good, 3 out of 6 maybe. I've had one good game about racism from the 10 people who have tried maybe. God, racism is so hard, to do it. To work with, period. But that's kind of like where we go. But I also I'm not cross-listed with philosophy.
How do you? I'm going to change the subject a little bit. How do you approach the idea of fairness?
We actually talk about it in the context of cheating and loot boxes. And in the context of cheating, we use Mia Consalvo has a book on cheating, and we use a chapter from her book. To sort of set the ground. And we sort of talk about how complicated cheating is because it is so socially constructed and defined. And in that sense, fairness is similar, right? And a lot of students have a hard time wrapping their head around that because they have sort of notions of an ideal sort of blank slate kind of, we can talk about, well, is chess fair? It's like, oh, chess is totally fair. Okay, is me playing chess against a 2-year-old who barely knows the rules, is that fair? And they go, well, that's not fair. Well, why is it not fair? He's in the same game. And I say, well, it's not fair because you know a lot more, you have experience and so on. Okay, so then how do we know what is fair? Like, is it dependent on the people? Is it dependent on our understanding? And so on. And then the concept of loot boxes, actually, more than loot boxes is this idea of pay to win, right? So I'm going to say a lot of Western students really object to pay to win. Especially a lot of competitive students object to pay to win because they say, well, it gets you an unfair advantage. And then I often have, so in our program, we have a lot of international students.
Likewise.
And so I can benefit from them bringing up the fact that, well, in China, for example, pay to win isn't seen as a bad thing. In fact, it's seen as a more honest thing, actually. It's like, well, how is that more honest? Well, it's like, if you're richer, you do better, and that's just the way it is. That's and it's okay for you to do better in the game if you're richer in the real world. If you're richer in the real world, you will do better in a lot of things in the real world. You will be able to eat better food. You will be able to have a better house, a bigger place. All those kinds of things.
Why not better weapons? Right.
Yeah, and for the students, they had never made that connection, right? They sort of realize I guess I hadn't realized that.
Does that force them to think about whether or not that bigger issue is fair or not?
Yeah, and to also think of what advantages or disadvantages they might have as well in the game, and why are they interested in the game? Are they interested in the game because it's presumably a temporary context in which everything that was a part of you is left at the door, right? It's a place where if you're richer or poorer, it doesn't matter. If your skin color is this tone or that tone, it doesn't matter. And I think that's a world that many of us would like to live in, right? Where it doesn't matter what your skin color is and so on. But it forces us to think about, to recognize that even in that world, there's still some stuff that is coming out from the outside and coming in. And where do we draw the line, and for which things and why, right? Do we draw the line is it intellectual capacity? That's okay. Is physical ability, that's okay. Is why do certain things get left at the door and others don't, right?
This is the magic circle, right? I mean, this is right that we discussed. Yeah, and
Yeah, our very first episode was about the magic circle and how permeable it is and how permeable it isn't.
Yeah, and the answer is, well, it's a concept that's useful for thinking about things because obviously it's 1,000,000% permeable, right? And we see this in games too, right? Are American football players in the NFL, are they playing a game? And we debate this endlessly and say, well, they're professionals. They're getting paid to do this. So is it work? And it's like, well, yeah, it's work, but it's also a game and it's also fun. But there's money at stake and injuries are real and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, that's no different to me than I'm logging on to play Clash Royale and I spent, $500 getting all these crates and I got some really good cards and I leveled them up. And so I'm able to make my way to a certain point in the ladder because I have these cards, right? And sort of just recognizing within games, right? It's how much of your success was based on your skill, how much of the success was based on your luck, how much of your success was based on additional factors that may or may not have been in your control, like how much money I was willing to spend, how much time I was willing to spend practicing, and so on.
Right. And that's before we get into your genes and where you happen to be, where you happen to be born, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. And to be fair, so this class, because it exists in the context of a broader program, there's a lot of things that I might spend more time talking about if they weren't all game students.
Right.
So in my game design class, we talk about game balance.
Right.
And so there's a very different notion of fairness in that context, right?
Right.
But the students will often be taking both classes. And so I know that I can kind of rely on, remember, depending on which order they take them in, remember in ethics when we did this, now we, let's look at it now in this other context and vice versa. So I do get a bit of the benefit of being able to lean on other classes. In
our show, we talk about topics in intersection of ethics and video games in kind of three different ways, right? So social ethics about video games, right? Like addiction, right? Things that impact society, right? Ethics in video games like cheating or trolling. We just did an episode on trolling. It was super fun. And ethics of video game designs, right? So, things like morality systems. Which do you think is the most important for game designers to be thinking about?
Game designers, or do you mean game developers?
Game developers. Sure.
Yeah, let's broaden it out.
Yeah.
Okay. The social aspects, I think, are the most important. And I say that in the sense of this is where your work will have the biggest impact on the world. If you want to be a really good craftsman or craftsperson in designing cool systems, then maybe you might have an interest in morality systems and cool AI things that you could do and so on and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, your game is something that you want to throw out into the world. You want other people to play it. If you are looking for commercial success, you want millions of people to play it. And in that sense, the impacts on society are perhaps the most significant part of your game's legacy. And I think thinking and talking about those parts of the legacy that are unknown, unwritten, underneath the surface, I think should be at the forefront of every game creator's mind. I'm not saying this is all you need to think about, but I think if you're not worrying about how will the world be a better place by my putting this out there in the world, if you don't have an answer to that is satisfying to you, then why are you doing what you do? And I think some people say look, I'm putting this out there because I need to make rent. I got bills to pay. I need to put food on the table. I think that's totally valid and legitimate and fair. I'm not saying every game needs to make the world a better place. Right? But I think if anything, if you think of someone as a game creator, as a professional, and as someone who wants to become better at their craft, maybe that's a good vector to chase, right? Is I'm better at making games because every game I put out there, I think, does the world a favor and it makes the world a better place. And I think if you're on your deathbed as a game developer, man, what are you proud of? I'm proud that through the games I helped contribute towards making and getting out there, the world became better. And I think no one would object to what a waste. You should have said you would rather spend more time in the office. No one says that, right?
Right. Though, of course, it also goes the other way, right? What's your biggest regret? Right. And just as design developers could be proud of what they do, they could also regret things that they've done. Right? And the last thing you want to do is be thinking about, God, I really wish I didn't do that as part of my legacy.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man, I should not have contributed to that game that led to. And did a game lead to things? That's already a super challenging and problematic question and difficult to answer. Right. But I think this is sort of in the thinking in the long term and the ideal, right? And perhaps even in this is maybe very Aristotelian, right? It's in the think of the eudaimonia or eudaimonia. I never know how you're supposed to pronounce that. So
Eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia. There we go. So in that sense, right? Like I'm always going to chase this better version of myself, and I'm going to chase this better version of myself also in the things that I do. Like I'm going to chase making a better game that is better for good reasons. And I think if you nail that side of like one of the themes of your show, then I think the cheating, the trolling, the ethics in video games, and the ethics of video games, that sort of it comes along. I think you get that for free.
Yeah, I think you're right, and the ethics of the business of making video games too sort of comes along for free with that too.
Yeah, right. So this kind of brings you back to what you said earlier about being a professional, right? You want to think about what it means for you to be a professional in the way that is a way of being that you could be proud of.
Yeah.
Jose, can you take us out with just like, can you give us like your top 3 of the things that you think is most important today when it comes to video games and ethics? Oof. Or let's say top 2.
or how about this? What are the top 3 most recent games that are really good games to look at for ethics?
You get a choice there.
Such a hard question. Oh, so many hard questions. And I'm supposed to come up with a snappy, short response, and then and then the episode ends. It's a 2-part challenge for people that are in the industry. I think perhaps for too long, many of you have been not thinking about some of the issues that the industry has, and I'm not trying to like throw anybody under the bus here. And so, in that sense, I think starting to have these conversations and to really act and to start to do things to make the industry a better place to work, but also an industry that is more responsible about the things that it does, I think is super important. So that's the first level of challenge. And we might say that, well, that's a challenge that we're going to fight, but we're never going to win that. And so the second challenge is to people who are thinking of entering the industry. Maybe you're a student, maybe you're someone who's moving sideways from one career to another, and to say, okay, as a new person to the games industry, you are super important in that you can be a driver of change. And so the challenge is, how do you join in industry and help it turn into what you would like it to be, than rather than sort of conform to what it already is. And in a super like really, really, really narrow example that I tell my students, I basically tell them, look, when you're interviewing for a job, interviewing is a 2-way street. The company is trying to determine whether or not they want to hire you, whether they want you to join their team, whether you will be an asset to that team. But you are also interviewing them, and you need to decide if this is a company that you want to go work at, and if this is a company where you would feel comfortable participating in. And so you have power in saying, no, I don't want to work at that company because I think they put out products that are really bad and they have no interest in changing that, for example. Or you have power in saying, I don't want to work at that company because they don't treat their workers very well, or whatever it is. And I think this recognizing each of us as an individual has power. As consumers, we have power to choose not to buy the games that were made under conditions that we don't agree with, or that have messages that we don't like, and so on. And I think we don't often think enough about the power that we have as individuals.
Jose, I got to tell you, this is a part of that is already coming into my end of class speech. It's so important. I realize, why am I not talking about that? All right. Thank you for coming on the show, Jose. We definitely hope to have you back.
Yes, please.
Jose, we do. I don't know if you've listened to any of the later episodes where we started. We have a kind of way of ending the show. We end the show with, instead of good game, we do a good podcast. So good podcast, GP.
GP.
Will you do it though? All right. Good podcast, Andy.
Good podcast.
GP all the way. Thanks for the invite. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to being invited again, assuming I didn't tank your ratings and your downloads and your listens.
You were
Not
wonderful.
possible.
Yeah. All right. Play nice, everybody.